Hello, I'm Eric Huang. You're listening to Saint Podcast, a podcast about the always fascinating and often controversial lives of the saints. This is a history and culture podcast that traces the origins of morality tales of the saints, also known as hagiographies, and how they continue to impact life today. This ongoing series of Saint Podcast is dedicated to martyrs, saints who died as a result of their beliefs. Over the next 6 episodes, we'll hear about martyred saints ranging from a queen who bested the brightest minds of the Roman Empire, the patron saint of music, twin brothers who were doctors, and more. Saint Podcast Episode 5 is about another Roman citizen. Rather than hailing from the Eastern Empire like Saint Stephen, Barbara, and Margaret, this saint was from the West, a Hispano-Roman from modern-day Valencia in Spain. According to a 6th century legend, he saved the Holy Grail from destruction before meeting his end in Rome, where he was roasted alive. His last words to the executioner were, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side," making him the patron saint of comedians. He's also the patron saint of archivists, librarians, chefs, the poor, Rome, Rotterdam, Mexico, Canada, and students. This is the story of St. Lawrence and the search for the Holy Grail. The most complete account of St. Lawrence's life, as well as the life of his parents, comes from a 5th century manuscript written by an obscure saint named Donatus. The authenticity of this manuscript and Donatus himself is in question, but the story is really fascinating and it links St. Lawrence with Indiana Jones. St. Donatus' hagiography of Lawrence is based on 2 sources. Firstly, stories shared orally through the centuries, and secondly, a collection of poems called Liber Peristaphinan, or Crown of Martyrs. The poetry was written by a Hispano-Roman like St. Lawrence himself, a Christian named Prudentius, who had a profound influence on medieval literature, as well as more recent authors like C.S. Lewis. Donatus' work based on these 2 sources was written in Latin, then translated into Spanish by Father Buenaventura Alsina, an academic and Augustinian cleric in Salamanca, Spain. This Spanish-language work was in turn translated into English by author Janice Bennett in 2004. It's Janice Bennett's translation I referred to in this episode. St. Lawrence's father Orenico and his mother Paciencia are a wealthy couple in Huesca, Spain. Christians in a time when the religion was illegal and practitioners were being persecuted by order of Emperor Severus. Historical evidence doesn't support any persecutions under Severus. Nevertheless, the couple leaves Huesca for Valencia when a change in local government signals certain doom. It's in Valencia that Paciencia discovers she's pregnant, a situation that fills the couple with much anxiety since they're now poor, living as refugees in Valencia. One day, Paciencia meets a wealthy woman named Columba whilst praying. The women have a chat, and Paciencia confides her family's situation. Columba takes pity on her and becomes her new friend's benefactor, hiring Paciencia to make new clothes for her sinful daughter, a young woman named Eleuteria, who's tormented by the devil. When Columba's daughter Eleuteria puts on Paciencia's blouse for the first time, the demon that possessed her leaves the body, screaming. Columba immediately makes a trip to Paciencia's hovel to thank her for miraculously saving her daughter. When Columba gazes upon the squalor that is Paciencia and Orenico's home, she's overcome with sympathy and invites them to live in her mansion in the city center. The couple agrees, not out of greed, Donatus stresses, but to give their unborn child the comfort and safety it deserves. Orenico and Paciencia's child Lawrence was born on the 26th of December on St. Stephen's Day, in the year 225. Lawrence was baptized on the Feast of the Epiphany, also known as Twelfth Night, the day when Christians celebrate the 3 kings' journey to Bethlehem to recognize the newborn baby Jesus as the Messiah. These are auspicious dates indeed. In fact, Donatus tells us that Paciencia felt no pain at all during and after labor. It seems as if God himself watched over Lawrence's birth. St. Lawrence's name comes from the Latin Laurentius, which means man from Laurentum. Laurentum is a town in Italy named after the laurel, a tree sacred to the Greek god Apollo, whose leaves are used to make wreaths, signifying champions and excellence. The bay laurel is the plant that gives us the bay leaf, used in spaghetti sauce. The dates of Lawrence's birth and baptism, as well as his name itself, all point to future greatness. But before that would happen, Paciencia and Orenico had to flee persecution again, this time to Italy. After the ship that carries them wrecks on the coast, a sign that God wants them to settle here, the family sets up a farm in Campania. Lawrence grows up helping his father with menial labor on the farm and becomes a muscular, handsome young man. He's also very intelligent. Donatus tells us he bests all of his schoolmates in both physical and academic contests. But he finds the pagan teachings at his school to be shocking and prays that he will one day have a Christian teacher. Lawrence's prayers are answered when a Greek man named Sixtus, working for Pope Fabian, comes to town. By coincidence, or maybe divine design, Sixtus and Lawrence both happen to be at the house of Lawrence's schoolmate. Lawrence overhears the adults discussing mysteries of the Christian faith and is really impressed by Sixtus's opinions. Lawrence prostrates himself at Sixtus's feet and begs the older man to take him on as an apprentice. Moved by Lawrence's appearance and passion, Donatus tells us, Sixtus takes on the boy, and together they journey to Rome. Lawrence's parents, who stay in Campania, meet their end shortly after, when a third round of Christian persecutions sees them beheaded. Donatus's 5th century hagiography mentions a cousin of St. Lawrence's named Vincent, who becomes a saint as well. In the Golden Legend, Sixtus accepts both boys as his disciples. In other versions of the story, Lawrence brings Vincent to Rome later on. Donatus only mentions Vincent in passing. From here on, Donatus's story matches the basic details of all other hagiographies, the ones that omit the narrative about St. Lawrence's parents and his childhood. There are conflicting stories about where Sixtus meets Lawrence. Some say they meet in Italy. But all versions of St. Lawrence's legend essentially meet up now that we're in Rome. Sixtus becomes pope in 257, and Lawrence, one of Sixtus's most trusted companions, becomes the first archdeacon of Rome, whose job it is to supervise the distribution of alms, food and money to the poor, and also maintain the treasury of the church. Recall that St. Stephen was one of the first ever deacons of the Christian church. We covered this story in episode 1, St. Stephen the Protomartyr. The year is 258. Valerian is now emperor of the Roman Empire. In early August, he issues an empire-wide edict that all bishops, priests, and deacons are to be arrested and beheaded. Pope Sixtus and all of his deacons, including Lawrence, are arrested and await trial. The Golden Legend places the timeline about 10 years earlier, when Philip the Arab was emperor, not Valerian. Philip was born in Orontis in modern-day Syria and became emperor of Rome in 244. In the Golden Legend, Philip and his children, in particular his son Philip II, are Christian, making Philip the first Christian emperor. This is unlikely. Historians agree that Constantine was the first Christian emperor. Emperor Philip reigns for only 5 years, and either dies in battle against Decius, a rival who was once a supporter and a trusted general, or he was murdered by his own soldiers. The Golden Legend names Decius as Philip's murderer, who entered the emperor's tent at night to slit his throat. No matter the manner of Philip's death, Decius becomes emperor after Philip dies. In the Golden Legend, the murder of Philip by Decius is motivated by greed. Decius wants to be emperor, but he also wants Philip's wealth. Philip's son, Philip II, however, has other ideas and gives all of his father's fortune to Sixtus and the Christian church. This detail in the Golden Legend version of the story, Decius's greed, provides an additional motive behind the persecutions and Sixtus's arrest. Decius knew Sixtus had possession of Philip's treasure, riches that the emperor wished to fill his own coffers. When Sixtus was arrested on August 6th, he instructed Lawrence to empty the church's treasury and distribute every last jewel, gold medallion, and coin to the poor. Lawrence does as he's told. Both the Golden Legend and Donatus's manuscript describe multiple miracles as Lawrence secretly visits Christian safe houses to dole out the treasure. Aches and pains are cured with a touch, blindness with a prayer. When the treasure has been distributed, Lawrence visits Sixtus in prison to tell him the news. He arrives just in time as Sixtus is being led away to be beheaded.
Forsake me not, Holy Father, for I have dispended the treasures that thou deliveredst to me.
The jailers overhear the conversation and tell Decius, who obsesses over the word treasure. Lawrence is handed over to a jailer named Hippolytus to make Lawrence reveal the location of the wealth. Lawrence refuses and is thrown into a prison cell. That evening, Lawrence cures a fellow prisoner of blindness. Word spreads of this miracle, and by morning, a long queue of blind people forms outside Lawrence's cell. One by one, he cures them and converts them to Christianity. The jailer Hippolytus witnesses all of this and starts questioning his faith in the Roman gods. Lawrence approaches Hippolytus.
If thou wilt believe in our Lord Jesus Christ, I shall show to thee the treasures, and promise to thee life perdurable.
Moved by Lawrence's passion and steadfastness, as well as the multiple miracles he's just witnessed, Hippolytus converts to Christianity. The next day, Lawrence stands before the prefect, which the Golden Legend names Valerian, not the emperor from Donatus' hagiography, but another Valerian. The names of the two principal Roman characters in this part of the story, Valerian and Decius, are swapped. Historically, it's more likely Valerian is the emperor when this story occurs, and the prefect is named Decius. Donatus' version is more likely the accurate one. From now on, I'll refer to the emperor as Valerian and the prefect as Decius, since this is the most historically probable. So back to the story. Hippolytus brings Lawrence to Emperor Valerian, who demands once again to know the location of the treasure. Lawrence has an idea. He asks for 3 days to gather the treasure. Emperor Valerian agrees. In the meantime, Pope Sixtus finally meets his end. He's beheaded along with all of his deacons except for Lawrence. Their names are Januarius, Vicentius, Magnus, Stephanus, Felicissimus, and Agapetus. Prudentius's poem, Crown of Martyrs, says Sixtus was crucified. This is very unlikely true. The punishment for being a Christian at this time was beheading. At the end of 3 days, Lawrence returns to court and to Emperor Valerian. Instead of boxes of gold and jewels, he enters the chamber with an entourage of poor and disabled people. Lawrence addresses the court.
These here be the treasure perdurable, which shall not be minished but increase, which he departed to each of them. The hands of these men have borne the treasures to heaven.
Lawrence tells Valerian that it's the poor and the indigent that are the church's greatest treasure. This statement is echoed in an older Roman story about the jewels of Cornelia. Cornelia was a wealthy Roman woman who lived between the 190s and 115 BCE. She was a historic figure who became a legendary ideal of a virtuous woman who was also a writer. She apparently dressed in a far more modest way than her vast wealth and station allowed, and maybe even required. When asked why she didn't accessorize and adorn herself with jewelry in the latest fashions, she replied, "These are my jewels," indicating her sons. So Lawrence had defied the emperor and presented a throng of common people as the church's treasurer. Valerian doesn't really buy into Lawrence's "the poor are the church's greatest treasure" speech and hands him to the prefect Decius to begin the torture. First, Lawrence is whipped with a scorpion, a scourge with multiple barbs ending in metallic hooks or studs. Then he's stripped naked and beaten with staves, burned with white-hot iron rods. More tortures ensue, each ending with a declaration from Decius that Lawrence need only to make sacrifice to the Roman gods to gain his freedom. Lawrence remains steadfast and prays to God that his ordeal might end soon. A voice from heaven answers,
"Yet many torments be due to thee."
The divine voice tells Lawrence his tortures are to continue. God isn't abandoning the deacon, however. There are more souls to save. There's more for Lawrence to do before being granted the honor of martyrdom. One such soul is a guard, often called a knight, named Romain, who is moved by Lawrence's plight. He approaches the saint.
"I adjure thee by the living Lord God that thou leave not, but haste thee to baptize me."
Romain wishes to be a Christian. He fetches a container of water, and Lawrence baptizes the pagan. Now a Christian, Decius' men seize Romain. He is beaten, then beheaded. Hippolytus, the guard who witnessed Lawrence healing the blind from earlier, leads Lawrence back to his cell that night. Hippolytus wishes to reveal his Christian identity and die alongside Lawrence and Romain. Lawrence gives this advice:
Hide Jesus Christ within thee, and when I cry, hear and come thither.
Lawrence instructs Hippolytus to keep his new religion a secret. The implication is that Hippolytus could do the work of God better as a closeted Christian, like St. Sebastian, rather than confess and face certain execution. This story of Lawrence convincing Hippolytus to keep his Christianity a secret is one of the legends surrounding the historic Hippolytus of Rome, a very influential theologian whose identity is attested but unknown. He was likely a Christian from what is now the Middle East. His connection to St. Lawrence, however, is likely legendary. Lawrence now undergoes additional tortures, which Donatus lists. He is beaten with a device of lead balls and metallic discs attached by ropes to his stick. Then his teeth are knocked out. Finally, Decius brings forth the final instrument of torture, the instrument of Lawrence's death, a man-sized gridiron. The guards strap a naked Lawrence onto the grill and light the kindle and fuel beneath it to slowly roast him to death. As Lawrence burns, he doesn't feel pain per se, but a divine rapture. Donatus' manuscript describes this in detail.
The fire from the coals that were toasting his members was not as active as the burning volcano of the love that was burning in his heart. And thus, insensitive to the one and inflamed from the other, he was refreshed with the pains, and desired to have even more lives to offer to his Creator.
Witnesses to Lawrence's ordeal are moved by his plight, as well as by his physical form. Despite having been disfigured and beaten up, onlookers saw not a broken man, but one that was, as ever, quote, extremely beautiful in appearance, according to Donatus. As Lawrence roasts, only Lawrence's killers detect the odor of burning flesh. To the rest, the cooked body has a sweet scent. At this point, St. Lawrence utters his famous line,
Thou cursed wretch, thou hast roasted that one side, turn that other, and eat.
It's this joke delivered moments before his death that makes St. Lawrence the patron saint of comedians. And it's the manner of his death, being roasted alive, that he's also the patron saint of chefs. There are several culinary schools named after the saint, including the prestigious Cucina Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence. Lorenzo is Italian for Lawrence, and the patron saint of the powerful Medici family that ruled Florence and Tuscany for centuries. Donatus' manuscript provides a precise location for Lawrence's death, the Thermals of Olympia, a spa complex on the Viminal Hill, the smallest of the 7 hills of Rome. It was built between 298 and 306 in honor of Emperor Diocletian, the same Diocletian that executed St. Sebastian. The spa complex provides a background scenery for many St. Lawrence paintings. Nearly all of them show him naked, or nearly so, reclining on a grill, surrounded by nude male bodies taking in the waters at the thermal baths. Other works of art are more symbolic depictions, showing a clothed saint dressed as a deacon, accompanied by a man-sized grill sometimes leaning against him. My favorite painting of St. Lawrence is by Bronzino. The painting is a fresco at the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence. The work looks like a scene from a Roman bathhouse, with nude and nearly nude figures in various poses. It's very evocative of the Last Judgment fresco by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. Emperor Valerian, or Emperor Decius depending on which version of the legend you subscribe to, stands at the far right of the painting, looking every bit like Caesar at a gladiatorial battle, pointing at Lawrence, reclined on a grill in the center. The emperor stands beneath a statue of Hercules, which is a portrait of Cosimo I, the ruler of Florence and Tuscany. Cosimo I de' Medici was one of the most influential and powerful figures of his age, and whose dynastic patron saint is Lawrence. That St. Lawrence was the patron saint of the powerful Medici family and of Rome itself shows how very important he was in the past. And although many people today aren't familiar with his legend, St. Lawrence's story intersects with one that nearly everyone has heard of, a tale that has been told and retold in books, film, television, and even video games. The legend of St. Lawrence is a key component in the epic tale of the Holy Grail, the cup that Jesus and his closest followers, the apostles, drank from the night of the Last Supper, just before his crucifixion. It's an event that lies at the heart of Christianity, the moment Christ revealed he was going to die so that humans could go to heaven. He did this by blessing bread, symbolizing his body, and sharing it with the apostles. Then he poured wine into a cup, symbolizing his blood, and shared the wine. This cup, the Holy Grail, is said to have been used later to catch droplets of Jesus' blood as he died, crucified on the cross. The Holy Grail has inspired countless books, films, and even video games. Different traditions describe the Grail as a bowl, cup, a dish, even a stone with a depression in it. The word Grail is Latin and means a water vessel. The Holy Grail is said to have magical properties. Water from this cup can provide eternal youth and happiness, an unlimited supply of nourishment. The Fisher King from Arthurian legend is the last in a long line of men charged with keeping the Grail safe. He's often a wounded older man, sustained only from the magical waters of the cup. He first appears in printed form in Percival, The Story of the Grail, a 12th century work by French poet Chrétien de Troyes, who put down on paper the manifold stories we now call the Arthurian legends. The Holy Grail is the subject of 8 Arthurian works from France, Wales, and Germany. The Grail also appears in stories about Joseph of Arimathea, the man who buried Jesus' body after the crucifixion. Joseph was charged with keeping the Grail safe, and eventually brought the cup to Glastonbury in England, where his story intersects with that of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Other mentions of the Grail include T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, one of the most important poems of the 20th century. It's a musing on British society and life in London, combined with the Fisher King and Holy Grail legend. Most people, however, are familiar with the Holy Grail because of the 1970s Holy Grail film by British comedy troupe Monty Python. It was a massive success, a parody of Britishness and comedic retelling of the Arthurian legend. About a decade later, in the Indiana Jones film The Last Crusade, the Grail and its powers of resurrection had the potential to tip the balance of World War II in favor of the Nazis, who were desperate to find it. Indy, played by Harrison Ford, and his father, played by Sean Connery, are on a quest to beat the Nazis and find the Grail before they do, and eventually bury it in modern-day Turkey, preventing anyone from using its powers for evil. In the 90s, the Holy Grail became an object of great power in the Sailor Moon universe, a manga and anime series from Japan. And in the 21st century, the Grail was revealed to be a person rather than a cup in the 2008 Assassin's Creed Altair's Chronicles, the next in a line of hugely successful video games steeped in Christian legends around the Knights Templar and holy relics. All of these stories, from King Arthur to Indiana Jones to Sailor Moon, are works of fiction. Some are rooted to a historic base, but all were written to be morality tales or entertainment, blockbusters. So where does St. Lawrence fit into all of this? Well, it's St. Lawrence who rescues the Holy Grail on the 7th of August in 258. The mystical cup is one of the many treasures of the Church Sixtus commands Lawrence to give to the poor. But Lawrence doesn't give away the Holy Grail. He confides in a man named Priscillius, who promises to take it away for safekeeping. Donatus explains.
To him he entrusted some memorable relics that he could send them to Spain, and among them the most distinguished cup in which Christ our God and Master consecrated his precious blood on the night of the Last Supper.
Donatus's account tells us the Holy Grail, along with some other choice items, were given to a fellow Hispano-Roman named Priscillius to take them out of Rome and keep them out of pagan hands. When Priscillius returns to Spain, he charges the abbot of the monastery of San Juan de la Peña in Huesca, where Lawrence's parents were from, to hide the cup and keep it safe. How the Holy Grail got to Rome from Jerusalem in the first place is a legend in itself, and ties in with King Arthur and the other legends from earlier. St. Peter is said to have brought the Grail from Jerusalem to Rome when he traveled there to become the Bishop of Rome, the first pope. The largely fictional legends we've already discussed would say that the cup traveled from Jerusalem to England carried by Joseph of Arimathea. Then King Arthur found it and safeguarded it in Glastonbury at the Tor until Camelot fell to Anglo-Saxon invaders. Sir Galahad, one of Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, fled with the Grail to the Isle of Iona in Scotland. When Vikings invaded the island in the 9th century, the Grail was part of the spoils of the siege and journeyed across kingdoms as far as Kiev, according to one source. After that, it disappears from legend and history until the 14th century, when we catch up where we last left the Grail in the St. Lawrence legend. In the year 1399, monks from the monastery of San Juan de la Peña in Huesca gave the Holy Grail to King Martin of Aragon, who ruled much of Spain as well as Corsica and Sardinia. The king placed the Grail in the chapel of his private residence in Saragossa. In 1424, King Alfonso the Magnanimous moved the artifact to the royal palace of Valencia. The cup was then sold to the church to pay for costly military campaigns, and it ended up at the cathedral in Valencia, where it remains today. This cup, called the Holy Chalice of Valencia, is kept behind glass in the chapel of the Holy Grail. It's made of agate, a smooth quartz that comes in a variety of colors. The Grail is coffee-colored with white creamy streaks, kind of like milk that hasn't been mixed into coffee yet. The cup is supported by gold hourglass handles that unify the cup with a base made of the same agate. Pearls and emeralds decorate the gold base and frame. Head to St. Podcast's social media pages to see the Holy Chalice of Valencia for yourself. It really is a lovely work of art. There's only one mention of the Grail in the Bible, and it isn't called the Holy Grail. It's in the Gospel of Matthew.
And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink this, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I shall not drink again of the fruit of the vine until I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom."
The cup's mention is brief. The focus of the passage is on Christ's sacrifice. There are no magical, miraculous properties associated with the cup. It's not referred to as a holy chalice or a holy grail, just a cup. St. John Chrysostom, an early church leader and philosopher from the 4th century, who became the Archbishop of Constantinople, had this to say about the cup and the Last Supper in general.
The table was not of silver. The chalice was not of gold, in which Christ gave his blood to his disciples to drink, and yet everything there was precious and truly fit to inspire awe.
Chrysostom's point was that the surroundings and the furniture and place settings at the Last Supper weren't noteworthy, or even anything out of the very basic. It was the friendship and love shared between Christ and the apostles, and what Christ was about to do in fulfillment of ancient prophecies that was memorable and fit to inspire awe. The cup? It was nothing. Historians and biblical scholars are unclear how this simple cup that was not of gold became so steeped in legend. The trope of a magical water vessel, be it a cup, a cauldron, or bowl, has deep roots in almost every ancient culture from China to Persia and the Americas. The most popular theory about the Holy Grail credits Celtic legends, in particular Welsh folklore, that blended with stories of the Eucharist when the Welsh were converted to Christianity in the 4th century. The first written account of the cup from the Last Supper outside the Bible comes from a travelogue by a Frankish bishop who made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the 4th century. His diaries mention the veneration of a cup in Jerusalem. The first time the cup from the Last Supper is directly linked to the Holy Grail is in a 12th century work by poet Robert de Boron, who composed many works about Camelot, King Arthur, and Merlin. He also wrote a poem about how Joseph of Arimathea acquired the Holy Grail. De Boron's work deeply influenced all subsequent Arthurian works, and also the perception that King Arthur's cup, the Holy Grail, and the cup from the Last Supper, often called the Holy Chalice, are one and the same. The Holy Chalice of Valencia is the most widely believed to be the cup from the Last Supper, but it's not the only one. The Sacrocatino, or Genoa chalice, kept in the cathedral in Genoa, is a beautiful Roman-era hexagonal dish made of green Egyptian glass. It looks like it comes from the Emerald City. The Crusaders who took it to Genoa from modern-day Israel in the year 1011 thought the bowl was emerald, a gem with powerful magical properties. The first time this green bowl is called the Holy Grail comes from a history book about Genoa, written in the 1290s by Jacobus de Voragine, the writer of the Golden Legend. Since the 19th century, 3 other chalices have been put forward as the Holy Grail. One of them, the Chalice of Doña Urraca, as recently as 2014. This chalice is another beautiful object made of agate, but greenish in color, like jade, instead of a coffee brown. It's also bound by a jewel-encrusted gold frame to hold together the top stone cup and the bottom base. Check out St. Podcast's social media pages to have a look at the contenders and maybe find the Holy Grail for yourself. The blackened and charred remains of St. Lawrence's body and body fluids are distributed around the world, many in Rome. Most are housed in bejeweled reliquary vessels that are works of art in themselves. The gridiron on which Lawrence died is at the Church of San Lorenzo in Lucina, Rome. The Church of San Lorenzo Fuori le Mura, also in Rome, contains body parts of both Saints Lawrence and Stephen, plus a stone slab that is reputed to be the place Lawrence's cooked body lay immediately after death. The Church of St. Mary at the Assumption in Lazio, Italy, has an ampulla filled with St. Lawrence's blood, charred flesh, fat, and ashes. The faithful say that the blood miraculously liquefies on the 10th of August, Lawrence's feast day, then recoagulates the day after. St. Lawrence has given his name to many towns and bodies of water. The St. Lawrence River in Canada was so named because French explorer Cartier arrived at the mouth of the river on St. Lawrence's feast day. Both the river and its estuary, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, are named after the saint. In Argentina, the district of San Lorenzo, Spanish for St. Lawrence, has a football club by the same name. French fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent's family name is French for St. Lawrence. It's an old name whose French origins can be traced to Provence, but ultimately comes from the Roman family name Laurentius. In Goa, India, where a quarter of the population is Catholic, the Feast of St. Lawrence on August 10th is the end of the monsoon season and the beginning of the fishing season. Festivities include the blessing of fishing boats and the sea itself by local priests. The 18th century St. Lawrence Shrine Basilica in the adjacent state of Karnataka is the site of many healing miracles attributed to Lawrence. It attracts pilgrims year-round, culminating on the 10th of August. Nowhere is St. Lawrence revered as passionately as in Rome, where the saint lived and died. His story has parallels to St. Stephen, the protomartyr from episode 1 of St. Podcast. Both were deacons who looked after the doling out of alms for their martyred pope. St. Stephen served in Jerusalem under St. Peter, the apostle, who was crucified upside down. St. Lawrence served Pope Sixtus in Rome, who was beheaded 3 days before Lawrence died. And so St. Lawrence's celebrations in Rome begin on August 3rd with a feast day called the Finding of St. Stephen. This day commemorates a story retold in the Golden Legend when the bodies of Stephen and 3 others were discovered in an unmarked grave, then taken to Rome for a proper burial. The details in this story are in episode 1, St. Stephen the Protomartyr. On August 6th, Pope Sixtus is remembered in Roman churches with a special mass in dedication to him. Saint Romain, the knight who witnessed St. Lawrence's tortures, then converted before being beheaded, is honored on the 9th. Lawrence's day is on the 10th. Then Hippolytus, the guard who Lawrence persuaded to keep his Christianity a secret, has his day on the 13th. This 2-week cycle of celebrations is all dedicated to St. Lawrence and the people around him. The remains of Lawrence's burnt head are put on display during this celebratory period at St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. St. Lawrence is one of the most revered Christian saints in the modern world. He was a favorite subject for artists through time and a key figure in the legend of the Holy Grail, which has itself given birth to numerous modern legends and conspiracies. the most popular of which are the fictional Da Vinci Code books by Dan Brown that transform the Holy Grail from a literal cup to a symbolic one in the form of Mary Magdalene. Before we end episode 5, I want to talk about St. Lawrence's death, that he was roasted alive. Patrick J. Healy, a professor in the Department of Church History at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., believes that the traditional view of how St. Lawrence was martyred is, quote, not worthy of credence. The Roman Empire edict to arrest and kill church officials in St. Lawrence's time was very specific in the manner of death. The word in Latin is animad vertantur, which ordinarily means beheading, a quick death, not a slow, laborious one like being cooked alive. Healy's research suggests that a typo led to confusion over the manner of St. Lawrence's death. According to Healy, and I'm quoting from his research now, the customary solemn formula for announcing the death of a martyr, passus est, was made to read assus est. Healy believes that the omission of the letter P from passus est, which means he suffered, the standard church euphemism for he was martyred, killed, became assus est, which translates into he was roasted. Was it a typo? Was St. Lawrence roasted, or was he beheaded? You be the judge. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of St. Podcast, St. Lawrence, The Search for the Holy Grail. Special thanks to Roderick Potts, who was the voice of St. Lawrence. Rod is the host of his own podcast. It's called Hasta la Visa Baby, a deep dive into the relationship between U.S. immigration law and fictitious characters from some of your favorite TV shows and movies. It's really hilarious. I didn't know immigration law could be so interesting. And big thanks once again to Amy Vanacore, whose piano student Joshua Lewis composed and performed the piano interludes. It's quite fitting because Joshua's dad is named Lawrence. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to St. Podcast and leave a review. It'll help other people find us. Feel free to follow our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts for updates and images of the topics covered. Our email is saintpodcast@gmail.com. That's Saint spelled out, S-A-I-N-T. We'd love to hear from you. The next episode in St. Podcast's ongoing series about martyrs is about a British saint. She lived in the 4th century when Britain was called Britannia, a province in the northern reaches of the Roman Empire. Her name means little bear, and she met her end whilst on a religious pilgrimage, along with an entourage of 11,000 virgins. Tune in next time for the story of St. Ursula and the 11,000 virgins.